Hello, good afternoon. Today in this live training, we're going to talk about fonts and some of the mistakes that I see as people are choosing fonts, and also what process to take to go through to choose them well for your brand. Fonts they matter because they can really add just another element to your brand. They're part of the puzzle of a brand that really sends a message that speaks to your ideal client. So it is a piece that you want to consider. I mean, it's not the be all end all of your brand, right? It's not something that you, need to agonize it over, but it is something worth considering. And the other thing that's interesting about fonts is it does tend to be a dead giveaway of an amateur brand. So especially as a designer, it's really easy to pick out brands that maybe haven't put a lot of choice into their fonts or are maybe piecemeal about it. So again, this is why we want to take some time and thought and make sure that we're sending the right impression with these fonts. It looks like we have Kim joining us live. Hey, Kim, thanks for joining me. And if you're also here, feel free to drop in a hi and let me know that you're joining me. Or if you're watching on the replay, drop a hashtag replay. If you're not sure who I am, my name is Allie Beck, and I'm a brand stylist and website designer. And I really work with service providers in particular to help them present themselves in a way that attracts their dream clients and books their dream clients. So when we're working, on brands and websites, we want to make sure that these things are actually working to get results, not just make us look pretty online, right? So let's dive into font selection here. Looks like we also have Christy, Natalie, Crystal. Hello, you guys. Thanks so much for joining me live today. And, it's interesting because I did get, we had a lot of people sign up to join for this live. So I know this is something that you guys have been curious about. So I'm excited to dive in. We could get really, really geeky as far as fonts go and talk a lot about the vocabulary and some of the background, but I'm going to kind of skip all of that and really just kind of stick with the practical application. I know that most of you aren't necessarily graphic designers, and so you don't need to know it all. Like, you don't need to know all the background and the terminology. But I did want to talk about maybe just like the different categories of fonts. And I think most of you are familiar with this. There are a variety of categories. Probably the ones that you're most familiar with are things like serif, sans serif, script. There's also things like display and slab serif. And there's a variety of others. Like you can look around and there's, huge variety. But those are going to be some of a starting point for us when we get into choosing fonts. So if you're familiar with that, let me know in the comments. And like I said, if you've looked around at fonts at all, you've probably heard those terms, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are. So first off, let's talk about some mistakes to avoid. And I want to preface this with, if you have made any of these mistakes, you are normal. You are like millions of other business owners, and so don't feel bad. And the nice thing about fonts is it is one of those things that is relatively easy to change for your brand. So don't worry about it too much, but I do want you to be aware of these things, because it is important to be aware of some of the things to avoid before you can start diving into what to actually focus on. So number one, this is probably the biggest mistake that I see, is that people use too many fonts. And this kind of crops up in two ways. Number one, it's that they're using like 4 or 5 fonts in one graphic or on a website. So there'll be like a font for a headline, and then a different font for a subhead, and then a paragraph font, and then maybe you've got a script font below. And so it just ends up looking sort of crowded and confusing and not very simple and clear. So that's one way. And then the other way that I see this is that people just change it up all the time. So you make a graphic one day, it has one font, and then you make something else the next day, completely different. And so maybe your Instagram feed or your Facebook feed is just full of every different kind of style that there is. And so that's definitely a common one I see. Number two is that the fonts that you choose look too close in look and style. So it's possible that you've chosen a couple different fonts and they're maybe slightly different, but not different enough. And it's a little bit like, say you're decorating your living room and you've got a dark gray couch, and then you buy a chair that's also gray and it's just like slightly different, but not enough. And I use this example because I've made this mistake in my own living room. But it's, if there's not enough contrast, then it looks a little bit off. Like it's like it matches, but it doesn't. So then number 3, the mistake that I see is that fonts are too different in style. So maybe you've got like a very classic looking, sophisticated looking serif font in your headline, but then you've got kind of a handwriting font as a subhead. So they almost like clash, or it's like kind of sending a mixed message because they're so different in style. So you do want them to be kind of similar enough where they kind of, there's like the umbrella over them is similar, but not so, different that it's, they look completely in different realms. So that's number 3. Number 4 is choosing fonts that don't have enough variety in their weights. And what I mean by this is like most fonts, not all, have different weights of them. So like they have a bold version, or they have a light version. They have an italic version. So you want a font that has some variety in that. And there are a lot of fonts out there that don't have any variety at all. They just have the regular standard font, and that's all you get. And so you want to watch for that when you choose something, that there is some variety in it, just because it's going to give you a tool to maybe add some variety in your content without changing up your font. So maybe you want to have a subhead that's bold, or you want to maybe call out pieces of your content, like certain phrases. You can bold that, or you can add italics there. And so it's just nice to have those options available. And I always tell people, you want at least, at the bare minimum, you want, of course, you're going to have the regular version, but you want a bold italic, and an italic. So that's like your bare minimum starting point. And then there's tons of fonts that have much more variety. So maybe they have a light version, or they have a medium version, and they have italics in each one. And so again, it's nice to have some of that. And chances are you're not going to use all of them, but it's good to have it available. So Natalie asks, is bolding a font different than a font that comes bolded? So definitely there are a variety of fonts out there that just are naturally bold, right? They're just a heavy weighted font. And so yes, that would be different than that font having different varieties available. And usually you can find this, and I'm going to show you later when we're looking at these. The font will have a font family, and you can download the entire family, and you can see the different varieties of it, like they're like the light version or the italic version. So you just want to make sure that you have a couple different options when you go. And again, like I said, if you are downloading a bolder font, then maybe you won't end up using an even bolder version of that font, but maybe you will want something lighter, or you will want the italic version. So that's just something to be aware of as you're looking at options, and just making sure you don't end up with something that has nothing, right? Number 5 is legibility. And this is a big one. I see this a lot with script fonts, is people will find these beautiful script fonts, but you can't read them. So they'll put them on a graphic and maybe even write out an entire quote or entire sentence, and you can barely read it. And I think, especially when we're writing something, we know what it says, but we don't think like, well, maybe when someone's scrolling through the feed, or when someone's on my website, they're not going to take the time to sit and kind of decipher this font. So if you use script fonts, I tend to recommend to use them sparingly, at least the ones that are hard to read. There are some script fonts that are pretty easy to read, and others that are, not. So you just want to be aware of that. And that can come to play with other types of fonts as well. If they've got, lots of just embellishments on them, if it's too busy, or, maybe the letters run together too much, or the kerning's off, that's the space between the letters, then that can be a legibility issue. So just make sure as you're choosing your font that people can read it, that it's clear. Again, we are scanners, we are distracted. And so you want people to be able to decipher your message. That's the most important thing. And if they can't, they'll probably move on. So keep that in mind. Number 6 is choosing fonts that are too common, cliche, or generic. This can kind of come into play, like people will choose fonts that like come on their computer, or maybe you're looking around and you're just getting started. So you find a free font, you download that. And I would just, especially if you would choose a free font, just make sure that you look around a little bit and it's not one that's like super overused, because there's definitely, any free font is kind of subject to that, but there's definitely ones that are worse than others. So I would definitely avoid things like Comic Sans, Scriptina, Papyrus, Arial, Helvetica, Bradley handwriting, stuff like fonts like that have been around for a long time and just have gotten so overused that you see them everywhere and they just kind of become sort of cliche. And so then you kind of lose, like, the whole point of a brand, right, is to call you out and make you unique and separate you out from the crowd. But if you're using these fonts that are like so common that, they're everywhere, it kind of works against you there. So you want to be careful of that and just be aware of that. And again, super common mistake. In fact, I even made this mistake early on in my brand of choosing a free font that is fairly commonly used and have never gotten around to changing it because I'm too busy. And it's like the cobbler's shoes, your own brand gets put to the background. So it's on my list, but you know what? So I've been there with the best of them, and definitely is on my list to change out one of my fonts too, because I chose a free one and it was a mistake. So, and that's why, if you can spend a little money on your font, it's not usually that expensive, but it's worth it to kind of get something a little bit off the beaten track that like not everybody else has. Number 7 is using poor quality fonts. This is the one that can be a little bit trickier to parse out if you're not experienced at looking at fonts, but just in general, anyone can make a font and put it out there. So, and there's a lot of free fonts out there too. So when you are out looking around at something, it's easy to get something that maybe has like kind of a low quality to it. Like maybe there's something off about the letters aligning, or again, it's a kerning issue, like the letters are too smushed together. Or maybe they didn't even bother making numbers or symbols. So you go to write an and sign or a question mark, and there's no available symbol in that font. So just be aware of those kinds of things as you're looking through your font. Like watch for, do they have every single character? Do the letters look high quality? Those kinds of things. And again, if you're purchasing the font, some of that won't be as much of an issue. So I do recommend paying for your fonts. Number 8 is choosing fonts that don't match with your brand personality. So, I'm going to talk about this one in the next section, but you want to be able to be supporting a message, to be creating a style, to be sending the voice and the personality that fits with what you're going for. And so every piece of your brand should do that, including your fonts. So those are some of the common mistakes that I've seen, and love to hear from the ladies who are here if that's ever been you, if you've ever made any of those mistakes. And again, like I said, even I have done it. So you are not alone. And it's something I see again and again as I'm working with clients, or as I'm just, out on the internet and, looking through my feed. I see these mistakes a lot. So now we're going to dive into kind of maybe the process that you could take as you're choosing your fonts and how to choose them effectively. So number 1 is to consider your brand personality adjectives. We talked about this last month in the Brand Your Brilliance Challenge. Joanna, thank you for joining us. She said, I missed the beginning. So go ahead and watch with us for the rest of the way, and then you can go back and pick up the beginning again. There will be a replay. So you haven't missed that much. We talked about some of the mistakes that were common to choosing fonts, and then we're going to dive into how the process of choosing them. Natalie says, I just pick whatever font. And again, that is probably, one of the most common mistakes that I will see. And I get it, because there's a lot of fonts out there, and if you're making something in Canva, it's easy to just like grab a template and run with it. So, but once you have your brand fonts chosen, that's something that you can use again and again, and then you don't have to even make those decisions anymore, right? So number 1, again, is using your brand personality adjectives to make your choice. So like I mentioned, the challenge that we went through, we came up with brand personality adjectives as part of that challenge. And I talked a little bit about how to do this, but these are adjectives that you want as far as your ideal brand personality. So maybe that's something like vintage or rustic or sophisticated. So we went through a process of choosing those adjectives in this challenge. I'm going to actually be running that challenge again in June. So if that's something that you're interested in joining us, we picked colors, created a mood board, and kind of created the foundational element of the brand through this challenge. And so if you want to join us again next time, put challenge in the comments, and then I can send you the link to the waitlist. And I'll let you know when that one is coming up in June. So that's something that we did then. But if you haven't gone through that entire process, think about the style that you want your brand, the message that you want your brand to send, and make sure that you consider that as you are going through the process of choosing fonts. Number 2 is what you want to do is really just pick a headline font, a paragraph font, and maybe an accent font. The accent font is optional. You can you want to stick to those 2 or 3 fonts, and that's it. And I know that can feel hard. It's like, well, that's it, that I only get 2 fonts. But it definitely, from the user's perspective, it feels boring to us, but from the user's perspective, it feels clean and it helps you build recognizability. So you just want those 2, headline font, paragraph font. And then, like I said, some people throw in an accent font that's like a script or maybe a fun handwriting font or just something like that they use just occasionally. And you want to, it keeps everything clean and consistent. It makes your stuff not so busy. And in fact, I'm going to show you guys an example. And that's why I zoomed in today, because I want to show you some of this stuff. So I'm going to share my screen here. So here's an example that I just like pulled a snapshot off of Tony Robbins' website. And he's advertising an event on his website here. And you can see that he has like a pretty straightforward serif font here at the top in the headline, and a subhead that he's bolded, and then his paragraph font. So, these are pretty clean, simple fonts, right? And he's really just used 2 different fonts with varying weights. So it's okay to mix up the weights. Christy said, should we use those 3 fonts for logos? Not necessarily. So I would just stick with maybe 2 for your logo. Your main, like whatever you put your name in, and maybe you have like a description underneath, or like an identifier, like if you're a photographer, so you'd be like name photography. So those 2 could be different. I wouldn't pack 3 fonts into a logo. That's very little space for fonts to fit in. And Natalie says, Allie will tell you it's good and you should get bored of it. She's such a fun killer. It's totally true. Yes, if you are consistent with your brand, you will get bored with it. And if you are, then you're doing something right. Because I'm a big believer that, consistency is boring. It's like the non-fun thing that is involved in success. But I think that's something really important when it comes to branding. So coming back to this example, we've got this graphic that Tony Robbins created. This is actually what was really on his website. So I took that same graphic and I just changed up all the fonts, right? And you can see here, like immediately, it's a little bit harder to read. It's a little bit more confusing. It looks something like a little bit off and a little bit amateur about it, and not as streamlined, not as clean. So again, this is what happens when you mix up a bunch of fonts all in one graphic. And this is what happens when you keep it nice and clean and simple with like 2 fonts. So that's just me giving you an example of why not to use 1,000 fonts. Okay, so number 3 in the steps of choosing your fonts is to start with those categories that I mentioned. So things like sans serif, serif, script, the different options that are available. And based on your brand personality, start with one you think might be a best fit. So for example, if your brand personality is classic, minimal, or sophisticated, maybe you want to start with a serif font. That might be a good option as a starting point. And this doesn't necessarily have to be where you end up, but at least it gives you like a start, right? It gives you it narrows it down a little bit, because I mean, there are a million fonts in the world and it can get super overwhelming to make that choice. So kind of narrow it down to a category. And maybe if you spend some time in the serif font category and you're like, I'm just not finding the right fit, then, try something different. Or like say your brand is like more whimsical, spiritual, free-spirited. Maybe you want to look into like more of a handwriting style or as an accent font. or a subhead, you know, or something a little bit more that has that kind of free spirit to it within reason. So don't feel like you have to get stuck in one category, but again, some of those things can kind of help you narrow things down. Like a sans serif can look very clean and minimal if you want to be straightforward. And you're going to do this with each one of your, you know, both headline and then your paragraph as well. And then again, if you're looking for an accent font, you can look into scripts or handwriting. I like to use the accent font, like if you're just doing a little call out on a graphic, like, hey, or like today, like something, you know, just like one word that's pretty simple. An accent font can add a little splash to a graphic. Let's see, Christy said, I meant, should logo font be the same as headline or paragraph font or accent, or can it have its own? That's a really good question. So you can use your logo font as your headline font, yes. But you don't have to. So I would say that if you don't, you want to keep something within the similar vein. Like sometimes our headline fonts are like really, they maybe have a little bit more embellishment in them, or maybe they're, you know, it's a scripty font. And so for that reason, you're like, okay, maybe I don't want to use this as my headline font because it would be too hard to read. On the other hand, like say your logo is a serif font that's really pretty and clear and it fits well with your brand style, then yeah, by all means, go ahead and use it as a headline font. Most of the time, and it varies as far as paragraph fonts, you can kind of give or take. There's some other considerations I'll talk about as far as that goes in later on in the section. But yeah, so if you've got like say you have a serif font for your main name in your logo, you could use that as your headline font, and then you've got a sans serif font that goes underneath that identifies you. That could be a potential for a paragraph font. So it's worth looking into and considering, and that way you're keeping everything consistent. But there's some times when that doesn't work too, so can go either way. Okay, so once you kind of have like some categories dialed in here, then do some research. And there's just so many different font banks out there. Just, I mean, so many more. I'm going to mention a handful today, but there's way more than that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And we're going to look at a couple examples. So this one here, and let me know if you can see this, is DaFont. And DaFont, the great thing about DaFont is it's a really huge bank of fonts. The downside of that is that there is some low quality fonts that can get mixed in here. And there is, because there are so many free options here, and because so many people contribute to it, you do have to be a little bit like, you know, it's kind of like going to Ross and you have to kind of sort through all of the stuff that's there, right? But they do have some great options. And so maybe you're like, okay, I want to check out like some serif options here. You can narrow it down to that category. And then you can even type in your text here and see what you're going to write it in as an example, and kind of sort through some different options. One nice thing, so you'll see here over on the right, it says free for personal use. The nice thing about that is you can go ahead and download this font and try it out first in a variety of different ways. And then if you're like, okay, this is the font that I want, then you can come back and buy the commercial license. So that's one advantage of DaFont is being able to try it out a little bit more. There's a variety of types of licenses here that you just want to keep an eye on. There are some you'll see 100% free or, you know, only paid options. So, you know, type in some different things here and just take a look at the different categories. And they have a broad variety of categories here, so, which is nice. Some of them get a little bit crazy. So the next option that I really like, and this is one of my favorite places to get fonts, is Creative Market. And I've talked about Creative Market on here before, but basically Creative Market is like a place for designers to sell their design. And the nice thing about that is, you know, you're supporting another business owner who's like a small business owner like you, who's got their stuff out for sale. And a lot of these are just really beautiful, high quality, unique fonts. So they have all sorts of stuff here. And you'll see fonts as one of the options. Hold on, my internet's working really hard. So let's see if we can get into the fonts here. I'm having a little bit of a slowdown. But you can, and again, they have all sorts of options as far as, you know, different styles. It's not wanting to move into that real quick. So, but definitely take a look at this one. The disadvantage of Creative Market is that you can't necessarily download it and try it out, but it does give you a place where you can try the font, you know. So I recommend going in and doing a bunch of different things, like putting some of your headlines from your website in, putting some common things that you might write in graphics, and just looking at it, you know, in a variety of different ways. And then another one is FontSpace. This is, you know, similar. They all kind of have a similar idea of, like, they have different styles. You can try them out. This one has a font generator, so you can look at some font pairings. And then we've got Google Fonts is another option. So the deal with Google Fonts is that these are open source fonts, so they are free. But the nice thing about Google Fonts is that they load fast on websites. So any website comes pre-installed with a lot of these fonts, and that makes your website run a little bit faster. So let me see here. I might have just lost you guys. Let me know if you can still see me. Okay. I think I'm running my computer a little bit, or my internet a little bit hard, because I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to come off screen share and just let it catch up. So again, the nice thing about Google Fonts is they come preloaded on websites, so your website will run just a little bit faster with a Google font. The downside, again, is they are free fonts. So what I generally recommend with Google Fonts is that maybe go buy something pretty and unique for your headline font. And then if you want to use a Google font for your paragraph font, that's a good place to do it, because generally paragraph fonts are going to be pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Maybe you're just using a serif font or a sans serif, so that's not a place where you're going to get super unique. So it's less important that it's something really, you know, distinctive. So generally, that's a safe bet. The other option is that you can choose a paragraph font that maybe has a little bit of a unique flair to it, but is still very readable, and then look for something similar for Google Fonts for your website. So that's an option there. Good. Sounds like you guys can see me. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so next, once you've, like, again, sometimes this can take some time to look through. There's just so many different varieties of fonts out there. And I know it can be overwhelming because, you know, there's, like, not only are there millions of fonts, but there's, like, tons of font banks. So a couple I didn't show you are Font Squirrel or 1001 free fonts. So you can, again, spend some time looking around at the different options. There are a couple of tools. We'll see if I can show you, if my computer will let me. Let's see, oops. Hold on, I'm looking for the window here. There's a couple tools that you can use to actually generate font pairings. And so one of them is called Mixfont. And you can see here that it's just paired two fonts together. And so it's basically giving you recommendations of fonts, and you can kind of cycle through some options here. You can lock one in, like swap, or you can swap them out and, you know, use one as a headline, one as the paragraph font. Here's another one that I like is FontJoy. They use 3, but so I would just kind of focus on the 2. But again, you can kind of just cycle through some options, and then say you find one you really like, you can lock it in and keep trying other paragraph fonts or headline fonts, whichever one. So those are some great tools that you can use as you are looking around. And I think that those tools are good starting points. Maybe they can give you some ideas, but ultimately I think it's good to look around on your own too and see what you feel like fits best for your brand personality and for you. In general, I mean, like I said, you want something that has kind of the same overall umbrella style, maybe the same feel that kind of fits in with your message, your brand personality, but you want them to have a little bit of a contrast. So you want them to be different enough where they are distinctive from each other. So that's just kind of some general guidelines as you're choosing. And then the last step to this process is to try them out. So you want to experiment you want to actually look at them. I can like so often I have selected fonts for a client and then I go and I use them. I put them in graphics. I pair them together. I write out paragraphs of text. And I can tell you that a lot of times I'm like, wow, this doesn't quite look exactly how I expected. Maybe it doesn't quite have the style I was thinking it did, or maybe they don't quite look as good together as I thought. So then I kind of go back and look for something else. So you want to try that out as much as possible. Like I said, it's nice if you can use, like in the case of Dafont, if you can download the font and try it out in a bunch of different ways. And if not, again, you kind of just have to use the in-app place where you type out a paragraph or something and just try a bunch of different things so that you're actually seeing different words, different letters, because sometimes something will surprise you. It'll be like, wow, that's a weird A. And so that just doesn't look right. Or one of the other things that comes up a lot is the numbers look really funky. So they're off, like the numbers are off base, or so you want to kind of look at all of that. What does it look like in caps, like all caps? Because maybe you'll want to be putting a headline in all caps sometimes. So kind of doing some experimenting, sitting with it a while. Maybe you do this with a couple different options, like you choose 2 paragraphs, 2 headlines, and you kind of just like cycle through and look at what they look like together, switch them out. So that's something that I always do for my clients is I show them in a bunch of different ways what these fonts look like. So I know that this can feel a little bit abstract, like this process. It does take some practice. It does take a certain eye to kind of like look for what looks together. What I would say is if you're in doubt, go simple. Because a lot of times people try to get too crazy and unique with their font and they end up with something that's trendy. So that means that like it might look good today, but like in a couple of years, it starts to look dated. So I would definitely say like if it's something you're struggling with, err on the side of simplicity, err on the side of classic. And, again, with staying within the brand personality that you have, but keeping it simple and not getting too wild or over the top with your fonts, making sure it's legible, all of those things. And, if this is something that like is super overwhelming for you and you want some help, this is part of my full service branding package. So among a lot of other things, including logo design, color selection, we go through a whole like strategic branding process. So fonts are one of those things that are included that I do for my clients. So I do all that selection for them. And then you can just sit back and make that, choice between the last 2. So yeah, if you're ready to elevate your brand and do that with me, then let's jump on a call and talk about what that would look like for you and your business. Just drop call and I'll leave that link in the comments to book a call. Or if you want to jump in and drop call in the comments, then I'll send you the link to book that call. If you have any other questions as you're thinking through this, comment below. The other thing is feel free to come back in and show your work. Like as you're working through this process, come back in on this feed and show us a couple options that you're looking at, or show us a graphic where you've tried out 2 combinations and ask like, does this really fit this brand personality that I'm going for? Or what do you guys think? What impressions are you coming away with when you see these font pairings? So use this as a place that you can get feedback. And because this is, like I said, this group is a safe place where you can kind of show your work, get some market research, get other people's impressions. A lot of times we have a certain impression about a font and then we realize other people think entirely differently. So it's always kind of nice to get that second opinion. Anyway, I hope that this has been helpful for you guys. And like I said, feel free to reach out with questions. And other than that, I hope you guys have a great day and I will see you next week.